So, the first thing that students of American history should be able to do is to fit our story into the general scheme of Western civilizations. Students need to understand that in 476 AD or CE, the Common Era, the last Roman emperor in the West was overthrown by a German warlord named Odoacer. The order that the Roman Empire had brought to Western Europe for 1,000 years was finished. By 500 AD, the centralizing power of Rome was no more, and Western Europe devolved into numerous warring Germanic kingdoms. For the next 1,000 years, while the Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantium, continued to flourish and grow, and sometimes thrive, a new economic and political system arose in Western Europe, and that was called feudalism. The system of weak central governments and powerful nobles existed until the modern age began in 1500. So, we students of Western history have a convenient timeline to help us make sense of this great expanse of time. The fall of Rome and the end of classical antiquity, the Greco-Roman world, ended around 500 AD or CE, and the Middle Ages in Europe began around 500 and end about 1500 AD. That's a long time, that's 1,000 years. And at the end of the Middle Ages, around 1500, we see the rise of the modern age begin, and that's 1500 to the present day. The rise of the Middle Ages. Therefore, we have two major periods of historical development to grasp and know: the Middle Ages and the modern age. With just a little reflection, we know that human history is continuous. It does not acknowledge arbitrary time frames, but we find them helpful nonetheless. The fall of Rome meant not only the loss of centralizing authority, but also a great deal of learning. Books were always copied by hand, and so much of the ancient learning of the ancient world was lost during this time period. And yet the memory of Rome and the grandeur of the classical world was always present in the medieval mind. It was observable in books that continued to exist, and all of the ruins that could be seen. The classical world left behind manuscripts. Law, for example, Roman law continued to be observed. Medicine, and the language of Rome, of course, was Latin, and that Latin was the language of the educated world, and that continued on for a very long time, well into the modern age. So, throughout the Middle Ages, the ancient world was kind of the model and a constant reminder of how superior Roman civilization was over the world of the Middle Ages. To some degree, educated people of medieval Europe tended to look back to a time of Rome for inspiration. You might even say that there was a little bit of an inferiority complex for the people of the Middle Ages. So, in that long 1,000 years after Rome and before the modern age began, trust me, a lot of good stuff happened. A lot of advances were made, and it's often they're referred to as the Dark Ages, and it's a misnomer. Okay. Anyway, that will conclude this section, and then we'll go on to the late Middle Ages next. The late Middle Ages. As feudal Europe began to fade, Europeans began to develop new and forward-looking perspectives. People of Europe began to see themselves the equals of Rome. It was a new spirit of confidence. To be plain, in fact, it was the emergence of the modern age in Europe that made it possible for a guy like Christopher Columbus and others to make his great voyage, right, of discovery. In point of fact, Western Europe, the maritime states, the seagoing states, broke free of the bonds of the Dark Age, of the Middle Ages. It's no accident that Columbus's voyage are contemporaneous with the discovery of the New World. If it hadn't been Columbus, it would have been someone else. simply because of the advancements in European navigation, shipbuilding, and so they would eventually have found it. So it was a matter of time before the continents of North America and South America would have been discovered. Okay. The next thing we'll look at is major factors leading to the modern age. Now we're going to look at some of the major factors leading to the modern age. We're going to stop for a moment and list a few of those important factors leading up to the birth of the modern age. As I said before, there were a lot of things going on during the Middle Ages. And the first 300 or 400 years of the Middle Ages are usually the period they call the Dark Ages. But we're going to start about 1000 AD, because that's when the Crusades began, when Western Europe was urged on by the papacy to invade the Middle East, to retake Jerusalem for Christianity. Now, ultimately, that effort failed, but while it was happening, the Europeans interacted with and made contact with the more advanced cultures of Byzantium, that is the old Eastern Roman Empire, which was still going on, and the Muslims. The Muslims and Islam had made great strides and advances in science and medicine and math and literature, all sorts of things. And so they got a lot of good things from their contacts with the Middle East. They began to learn more about luxury goods, silks and spices, things like that, and medicines as well, painkillers, one. So the Crusades was an important time for growth in Western Europe. Ultimately, it's very closely related to the rise of the Renaissance, the rebirth of learning. Between 1200 AD, 1300 AD, we see the introduction of gunpowder. Right? Gunpowder came originally from China and made its way west. And of course, with the gunpowder, weapons and cannons, and that was a huge game changer. It really is going to change politics, right? Because now whoever has the biggest cannons, right, is going to be the most powerful person. So gunpowder is going to play a huge role in the move toward the modern age. In the 1100s, there's a little-known guy named Leonardo of Pisa, more commonly referred to as Fibonacci. Fibonacci was responsible for importing ideas from the Muslims regarding the new counting system, or a newer counting system that originated in India, called Arabic numerals or Hindu numerals. That is the use of zero, right, in counting. And so ultimately, it was very slow to take on. Ultimately, that proved invaluable to the rise of science and so forth. So, between 1000 and 1400, as I mentioned before, contact with the Muslims in science and medicine and all of those continued apace. 1300 to 1500, over a 200-year period, we see the rise of the Renaissance, the rebirth of learning. And what did that really mean? It was the rise of art and literature, the rediscovery of ancient learning throughout Europe. There were monasteries where ancient books were sitting there and had been copied and recopied, and so they didn't even really know what they had. Of course, many books were brought into Europe because the Muslims worked very hard to preserve Greek learning, and so that's an important time period too, with just the rediscovery of ancient learning, the ancient Greek and Roman literature. Very, very significant. Then between 1450, around that time, we see the invention of the movable type printing press by Mr. Gutenberg in Germany, and of course, this is a whole new thing. This is as important as gunpowder, or more so. I guess the pen is mightier than the sword, or at least block printing is anyway. So we saw that now. Books can be multiplied, made in the thousands, one book, not just one book copied by hand. Maybe there are only 5 copies. It's pretty easy to lose books that way, right? So in this case, now we're never going to lose information after the printing press. No more is information lost permanently. So that's a huge one. In 1453, we saw the fall of the ancient Eastern Roman Empire, which had been around for 1,000 years since the fall of Rome. And so the Turkish people who become, followers of Islam, they finally took over Constantinople, Byzantium, and snuffed out that ancient Eastern Roman Empire. And of course, Istanbul today was once Constantinople. So, and by the way, they were able to defeat Constantinople with those big cannons. They used gunpowder and were able to blow down those walls, which had been, had protected those folks for so long. But the Muslims, the Turks, got hold of that gunpowder and those cannons and were able. That was a big game changer. You couldn't hide behind the walls anymore because you get blown down on it. Anyway, so there we go. Now that had so many spin-off effects because once the Turks took over, it disrupted the traditional trade routes coming from the Far East, bringing those luxury goods into Europe. Now it was, like I said, it was impossible, very difficult to get hold of goods, and if you could get them, they were outrageously expensive, whether it was nutmeg or cinnamon or vanilla or any of those things we love to make cakes with, pies with. You couldn't get that stuff. Very difficult. So Europeans began to think about how can we get around this problem, and so that we're moving. You can see that's going to lead eventually to people like Columbus seeking an alternate route to the Far East to tap into those, to get that stuff directly instead of having to pay those middlemen all the time. All right, so.